They said the girl had been dead for 20 years, so why did her footprints still press fresh into the mud? The rain had just started when Elias Boone first saw her, a thin silver curtain drifting across the edge of sacred woods, soft enough to hide a figure if you weren't looking straight at it, and he almost wasn't, almost kept riding past like every other man in town had learned to do, eyes forward, mind quiet, pretending the stories were just stories. But then she stepped out from between the trees, not hurried, not afraid, just there, like she had always been there, and something about the way she stood, barefoot on wet earth, dark hair falling heavy against her shoulders, eyes steady as a still creek, made his horse shift beneath him, uneasy in a way animals get when the world isn't quite telling the truth, and Elias tightened the reins without thinking, his boots creaking in the stirrups as he leaned forward just enough to see her clearer through the rain, maybe 20 paces away, maybe less, though distance felt strange near those woods. Like it stretched and folded depending on who was watching, and she didn't wave, didn't call out, didn't beg for help the way most folks did when they found themselves alone near a place everyone else avoided. She just looked at him like she had been expecting him, like he was late to something neither of them had agreed to attend, and then she spoke, her voice low, steady, carrying through the rain without effort. Your name was spoken here before you were born, and Elias felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear exactly, something older than that, something that lived in the bones rather than the mind, and he almost laughed it off, almost tipped his hat and rode on, because men who listened to voices from sacred woods didn't usually come back with stories worth telling. But then she turned, just turned without waiting for an answer, and began walking back toward the trees, slow, deliberate, as if she knew he would follow, as if the choice had already been made somewhere far behind him. And Elias sat there a moment longer than he should have, rain soaking into his coat, dripping from the brim of his hat, the town a mile behind him, the safe road stretching out in the opposite direction, and for a second he thought of turning away, of letting the stories stay buried where they belonged, but then he saw it, just at the edge of where she had been standing, a footprint in the soft mud, clear as daylight, toes pressed deep, heel firm, not the mark of something wandering or lost, but of someone who walked this ground like it remembered her, and Elias Boone had spent enough years reading land to know when something didn't add up, and whatever stood in front of him wasn't a ghost, wasn't a trick of rain and shadow, it was something real enough to leave a mark, and that was all it took, because a man like Elias didn't chase legends, but he did follow truth when it showed itself, even if it led straight into a place every other man had sworn to avoid, and so he nudged his horse forward, slow at first, then steady, guiding it toward the line where open land gave way to towering pines, where the air grew colder without warning and the light dimmed like someone had drawn a curtain across the sky, and just before the trees swallowed him whole, he glanced back once, the road behind him already fading in the rain, and realized something he couldn't quite explain, that the world he understood had ended the moment he saw her, and whatever waited inside those woods wasn't just a mystery, it was an answer, one that had been waiting longer than he had been alive. The moment Elias crossed beneath the first line of pine, the rain changed, not heavier, not lighter, just quieter, as if the trees had taken hold of the sound and folded it into something softer, something that did not belong to the open land behind him, and his horse slowed without being asked, ears twitching, breath coming out in slow clouds that lingered longer than they should have in air that suddenly felt 10 degrees colder, and ahead of him the girl kept walking, steady, unhurried, her bare feet finding ground that seemed hidden to everything else, and though the forest floor was thick with fallen needles and slick with moisture, she moved without a single stumble, without a single glance back, as if she trusted he would keep pace, and somehow he did, though every step deeper made the outside world feel farther away than a mile had any right to stretch, and Elias noticed things then, small things first, the way the wind did not reach past the first few rows of trees, the way the scent of wet pine and old earth hung heavier than usual, like it had been there for years without ever leaving. And then the quieter things, the absence of birds, the absence of insects, the kind of silence that was not empty but waiting. And he found himself listening harder than he had in years, the way a man listens when he knows he is not alone but cannot yet see who else might be there. And then she spoke again without turning, her voice threading through the stillness as if it had always belonged there. "Do you hear it?" she asked, and Elias frowned slightly, scanning the shadows between the trunks. "Hear what?" he answered. And she slowed just enough for him to come closer, not stopping, never stopping. "That is the point," she said. And he realized then that what unsettled him was not a sound but the absence of one, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears until you begin to imagine something just beyond it, something watching, something remembering, and he shifted in the saddle, adjusting his grip on the reins, though his hands were steady, always had been, even when things did not make sense, and that was when he noticed the ground beneath them changing, the soft brown needles giving way to patches of darker soil, damp and packed, as if many feet had passed through here long ago. And then simply stopped, and scattered among the roots were stones, flat and worn, set in patterns too deliberate to be natural, and he followed the line of them with his eyes until it led to a small clearing just ahead, where the trees opened slightly and the light, what little there was, settled unevenly across the ground, and she stepped into it without hesitation, stopping at last near the center, and Elias guided his horse forward, dismounting as soon as he felt the animal's reluctance deepen into refusal, the reins loose in his hand as he took a few steps closer, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, and that was when he saw it, not all at once, but in pieces, a rise in the ground. Where no grass grew, a shape too even to be random, and at its head a marker, weathered wood, carved long ago, the lines faint but still there if you looked long enough, and the girl stood beside it, her gaze fixed not on him but on the space just in front of the marker, like she was remembering something that had never been spoken aloud, and Elias felt that same tightening in his chest again, stronger now, because he had seen graves before, more than a few, and they all carried a certain weight to them, a kind of finality that settled into the air, but this one felt different, unfinished in a way he could not explain, like a story that had been stopped halfway through and left to sit, untouched, for far too long, and he crouched slightly, brushing away a thin layer of damp needles near the base, revealing the edge of something buried shallow beneath the soil, metal by the look of it, dulled by time but still catching what little light filtered through the trees, and he hesitated for just a second, then reached down and pulled it free, a small box, tin, no larger than the palm of his hand, its surface worn smooth in places, and when he looked up, she was watching him now, not surprised, not anxious, just waiting, the way someone waits when they already know what you are about to find, and her voice came again, softer this time, but heavier, carrying something that felt older than either of them. They buried a story here, she said, her eyes not leaving his. Not a girl, and Elias Boone, who had spent most of his life trusting what he could see and touch and measure, realized in that moment that whatever lay inside that small box was not just a piece of the past, it was the reason he had been brought into these woods at all. The tin box felt heavier than it should have, not in weight but in the way it settled into Elias Boone's palm, like it carried more than metal and time, like it held something that had been waiting for a hand willing to open it, and for a moment he did not move, just stood there in that quiet clearing with the damp air pressing in around him, the girl watching without urgency, without fear, as if she had seen this moment unfold 100 times before, and maybe she had, maybe not in the same way, not with the same man, but close enough that nothing about it surprised her anymore, and Elias finally let out a slow breath he had not realized he was holding and brushed his thumb across the lid, clearing away a thin film of dirt and age until the faint outline of a carving showed itself, a small bird with wings spread wide. Simple but deliberate, and something about it stirred a memory he could not quite reach, like a word on the tip of his tongue that refused to form, and he glanced up at her, searching for something in her expression that might guide him, but she only nodded once, a quiet permission that did not feel like permission at all, more like acknowledgement, as if the choice had already been made long before he ever stepped into the woods, and so he opened it, slow, careful, the hinge giving a soft, reluctant creak that sounded far too loud. In the stillness, and inside there was no gold, no coin, nothing that would draw a man for profit or greed, just two things resting side by side, a folded piece of paper worn thin at the edges and a small silver pendant, broken cleanly in half, its surface marked by the same bird he had seen on the lid, only clearer now, the lines deeper, more certain, and Elias felt that tightening in his chest again, sharper this time, because he knew that symbol, not from the town, not from the land, but from somewhere older, somewhere tied to his own past in a way he had never questioned until now, and he picked up the pendant first, turning it between his fingers, the cool metal grounding him in a way the rest of the forest refused to do, and he could see where it had once been whole, the edge smooth but incomplete, like something waiting to be joined again, and then he unfolded the paper, careful not to tear what time had already weakened, and the writing inside was faded but legible, the ink a soft brown instead of black, the hand steady, deliberate, and familiar in a way that made his breath catch before he even read the words, because he had seen that handwriting before, years ago, in a small wooden chest back at his ranch, letters his mother had kept and never spoken of, and now here it was again, in a place no one from his world should have ever touched, and the first line confirmed what his instincts had already begun to understand. If you are reading this, then the truth has found you. And Elias swallowed hard, the forest seeming to lean closer as he read on, each word pulling him deeper into something he could no longer step away from. The child they say is gone was never buried here, not in the way they claim. I took her when the night turned against her, when men chose silence over mercy, and I carried her beyond their reach, gave her a name that would not be hunted, and a life that would not be erased. And his hands tightened slightly around the paper, not enough to damage it, just enough to steady himself, because he knew what came next before his eyes reached the words. Knew it in the way the girl stood across from him, knew it in the way the pendant fit in his hand like something he had lost without ever knowing it. I could not undo what was done, but I could refuse to let it finish, and if one day she returns, it will not be for revenge, it will be because the land remembers what men tried to forget. And Elias lowered the paper slowly, his gaze lifting to meet hers, really meeting it now, not as a stranger in the woods but as someone standing at the edge of a truth that had been hidden in plain sight for 20 years, and she did not look away, did not soften, did not harden. She simply stood there, steady as before, and said in a voice that carried no anger, no accusation, only certainty, "You know who wrote that?" And Elias Boone, who had spent a lifetime believing he understood where he came from and what his name meant, realized in that moment that the story he had been given was only half of what had ever been true. The paper trembled slightly in Elias Boone's hand, though the air around him had gone completely still, and for a long moment he did not answer her, did not move. Because the shape of the truth settling into place was not loud or sudden, it was quiet, steady, like something that had always been there beneath the surface of his life, waiting for the right moment to rise. And when he finally spoke, his voice came out lower than before, roughened by something he could not quite name. "My mother wrote this," and the words hung there between them, heavier than anything the forest had offered so far, and she inclined her head just slightly, not in agreement, not in approval, but in recognition, as if she had known the answer before he had ever asked the question. And Elias looked back down at the letter, tracing the edges of the handwriting with his eyes, remembering the way his mother used to sit by the window in the late afternoon, sunlight catching in her hair as she wrote things she never explained, letters she folded and sealed and tucked away without ever sending, and he had never asked why, had never thought to, because some silences felt natural when you grew up inside them, but now those silences felt different, deliberate, like doors that had been closed not to keep something out, but to keep something in. And he folded the paper carefully, sliding it back into the tin box beside the broken pendant, his fingers lingering just a second longer than necessary before he closed the lid. And when he looked up again, the girl was no longer watching him in that distant way. She was studying him now, measuring something he could not see, and he realized that whatever this moment meant to him, it meant something entirely different to her, something that had been building for far longer than the time it had taken him to ride from town to the edge of these woods. And before he could ask the question forming in his mind, the forest shifted, not with wind, not with sound, but with presence. The kind of subtle change that makes the back of your neck tighten before your eyes confirm what your instincts already know. And Elias turned his head just slightly, scanning the tree line beyond the clearing, and there they were, shapes moving between the trunks, not rushing, not hiding, just approaching with a quiet certainty that made it clear they had been there longer than he had noticed, maybe longer than he had been inside the woods at all. And his hand did not go to his side, did not reach for anything, because there was no threat in the way they moved, only purpose. And one by one they stepped into the edge of the clearing, men and women both, their expressions unreadable, their eyes fixed not on him, but on the girl standing a few feet away. And the air changed again, thicker now, not with fear, but with something closer to recognition, something that carried weight without needing to be spoken. And then an older man stepped forward, his posture straight despite the years that had settled into his shoulders, his gaze steady and sharp as it moved from the girl to Elias and back again. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet authority as the forest itself. "You should not have brought him here." And it was not an accusation, not entirely, but it was not a welcome either. And the girl did not step back, did not lower her eyes, she simply answered, her tone as calm as it had been since the moment Elias first saw her. He was always meant to come, and something in the older man's expression shifted at that, not surprise, not disbelief, but something closer to resignation, as if he had hoped this moment would never arrive and had known all along that it would. And he took a few steps closer, stopping just at the edge of the disturbed earth where the tin box had been buried, his gaze dropping briefly to the ground before lifting again to meet Elias's, and for the first time since entering the woods, Elias felt himself being seen, not as a stranger, not as a trespasser, but as something connected to the place in a way he had not yet earned the right to understand, and the man spoke again, slower this time, each word placed with care. The story you carry does not belong to you alone, and Elias nodded once, because he understood that much at least, understood that whatever his mother had done, whatever she had hidden, it had not been hers to keep in the first place, and the man's gaze shifted back to the girl, and there, just for a moment, something softer passed through his expression, something that looked almost like grief. And when he spoke again, it was not to Elias, but to her. The name you bring back into this place was laid to rest 20 years ago, and the clearing seemed to hold its breath around those words, and the girl did not flinch, did not argue, she simply answered, her voice quiet but unshaken, a name cannot die if it was never spoken truthfully, and Elias Boone, standing between the weight of the past and the presence of those who had lived with it far longer than he had known it existed, realized that whatever this moment was becoming, it was no longer just about what had been hidden, it was about what could no longer remain buried. The clearing held its silence like a held breath, and Elias Boone felt it settle into his bones as the older man stepped closer, the others behind him remaining still, not out of fear but out of respect for whatever moment was unfolding between past and present, and Elias did not need to be told who this man was. The weight in his voice, the way the others stood behind him without question, it spoke plainly enough. And when the man's eyes met his again, there was no anger there, only a kind of measured distance, the look of someone who had learned long ago that truth does not always arrive with comfort. You carry her words, the man said, his tone steady, but you do not yet understand what they cost, and Elias nodded slowly, because that much was already clear, clearer than anything he had known before stepping into these woods, and he reached into the tin box again, drawing out the broken pendant, holding it up so the faint light could catch the engraved bird, and for the first time the group behind the elder shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to reveal recognition, and something deeper than recognition, something tied to memory, and the man's gaze softened just slightly as he looked at the pendant, that was never meant to be divided, he said quietly, and Elias glanced at the girl, a question forming without words, and she answered it without hesitation, reaching into the fold of her clothing and drawing out something wrapped in a small piece of worn cloth, and when she unfolded it, Elias saw the other half, the missing piece, the edge that would make his whole, and for a moment neither of them moved, the space between them filled with something that felt larger than either one alone, and then she stepped forward and placed her half into his open hand, the metal meeting metal with a soft, final click as the two pieces aligned perfectly, the bird whole again, wings spread as if ready to take flight after years of being held apart, and a quiet murmur moved through the group behind the elder, not disbelief, but confirmation. And Elias felt the weight of it settle into him, not as proof of something supernatural, but as proof of something far more grounded, far more human, something that had been broken by choice and could only be restored by the same, and the elder stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the rejoined pendant, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that had been held back for a long time. That child was not meant to be erased, he said, and his eyes lifted to the girl, and for the first time there was no distance in his expression, only a quiet, steady recognition, but she was, and the girl did not look away, did not lower her gaze, she met his eyes fully, she was hidden, she said, her voice calm, not lost, and Elias felt the difference between those words as clearly as if it had been placed in his hand alongside the pendant. Hidden meant someone had chosen to protect, lost meant someone had chosen to forget, and the elder gave a slow nod, accepting the distinction, even if it came with its own weight. And he turned his attention back to Elias. Your mother made a choice that night, he said, one that carried both mercy and silence, and Elias swallowed, because he could hear what was not being said as clearly as what was. Mercy had saved a life, silence had buried a truth, and both had shaped everything that followed, and the elder continued, for 20 years, this land has carried a name that was never spoken again. Not because it was gone, but because speaking it would have undone what others worked hard to hide, and Elias's grip tightened slightly around the pendant, not out of anger, but out of understanding, because he was beginning to see the shape of it now, not just a story of a child saved, but a story of something taken, something rewritten, something made easier for those who benefited from forgetting, and he looked at the girl again, really looked at her, not as a mystery, not as a guide, but as someone who had lived those 20 years in a space between what was true and what was allowed to be known, and he spoke, his voice steady despite the weight behind it. What was her name? And the question settled into the clearing, simple, direct, but carrying everything that had been avoided for 2 decades, and the elder did not answer right away, his gaze shifting to the others behind him, then back to the girl, as if the answer no longer belonged to him alone, and the girl took a single step forward, the damp earth soft beneath her feet, the rejoined pendant catching a sliver of light between them, and she said, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that left no room for doubt, Naeli, and the name moved through the clearing like something that had been waiting to be heard, not new, not unfamiliar, but finally spoken without fear, and Elias Boone felt something shift inside him at the sound of it, not because it changed what had happened, but because it gave it shape, gave it weight, gave it a place to stand in the open, and for the first time since he had entered the woods, he understood that this was not just about uncovering a past that had been hidden, it was about deciding what would be allowed to stand in its place now that it could no longer remain unseen. The name lingered in the air long after it was spoken, not echoing, not fading, but settling into the space like it had finally found where it belonged, and Elias Boone felt it take root somewhere deep inside him, because a name changes things, it turns shadows into people, turns stories into truth, and as he stood there with the weight of that truth pressing in from every direction, he realized the forest no longer felt like a place of mystery, it felt like a place of memory, and memory, once stirred, does not return quietly to sleep, and the elder, Chief Takoda, studied Naeli for a long moment, not as one might look at a stranger returned, but as one looks at something that had been carried in silence for too long, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, though no less steady, you should not have come back alone, and Naeli did not answer right away, her gaze drifting briefly toward the trees beyond the clearing, as if measuring distance not in miles, but in years, and when she finally spoke, it was not defensive, not apologetic, just certain. I did not come back alone, she said, and her eye shifted to Elias, and for the first time since he had entered the woods, he felt the full weight of being part of something he had not chosen but could no longer step away from, and Chief Takoda followed her gaze, studying Elias again, this time not as an outsider, but as a piece of a story that had returned with her, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was evaluating, measuring, deciding what place, if any, Elias Boone held in what was about to unfold, and then the chief spoke. The men from town have been riding the outer trails for 3 days, and the words carried a quiet urgency that shifted the air in the clearing, subtle but undeniable. They do not come for ghosts, he added, and Elias felt that settle immediately, because men who rode with purpose did not chase legends, they chased something they could claim, something they could own, and his mind moved quickly, connecting pieces that had not fully formed until now. The silence his mother had kept, the land records he had never thought to question, the way certain boundaries in the valley had always felt, unfinished, like lines drawn in haste and never revisited, and Naeli spoke before he could, her voice steady, they know the truth is close to being seen, and there was no fear in her tone, only clarity, and Elias looked down at the pendant still resting in his hand, the 2 halves now whole, and understood what she meant. Because truth does not need to shout to be dangerous, it only needs to exist where it was once denied, and Chief Takoda nodded once, slow, deliberate. For 20 years, the land has been claimed under a lie, he said, papers signed, lines drawn, ownership declared by those who said there was no one left to speak against it, and Elias felt something shift inside him again, heavier now, because he knew those papers, had seen them in the county office, had accepted them without question like every other man who believed what was written carried more weight than what was lived, and he spoke, his voice low but certain, my mother knew, and it was not a question, not anymore, and the chief met his gaze without hesitation. She knew enough to choose differently, he said, but not enough to stand against all of it alone, and Elias nodded slowly, because that sounded like her, strong in quiet ways, unwilling to let harm stand, but bound by something she could not fully break, and he looked at Naeli again, seeing her now not as a figure pulled from a story, but as the living proof of what his mother had tried to protect, and what she had not been able to restore, and Naeli stepped closer, her voice calm, but carrying something deeper now, something that had waited for this moment. They buried my name so they could take what was never theirs, she said, and Elias did not need to ask what she meant, the answer was already there, in the land, in the silence, in the way men from town had begun riding closer to the edges of something they thought was still hidden, and Chief Takoda's gaze hardened slightly, not with anger, but with resolve. If the truth is to be spoken, he said, it must be done where all can hear it. And Elias understood then what was coming, not a confrontation of force, but something far more difficult, far more final, a confrontation of truth against everything that had been built to keep it buried, and he tightened his grip on the pendant, not as a weapon, but as a reminder, and for the first time since he had followed her into the woods, he spoke without hesitation, without doubt. "Then we take it back to town," and the word settled into the clearing with a quiet certainty, and Naomi met his gaze, searching it for something, and whatever she found there was enough, because she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, and in that moment, beneath the tall pines and the weight of 20 years of silence, the path forward became clear, not because it would be easy, but because it was no longer possible to turn away. They left the clearing without ceremony, no raised voices, no final words, just the quiet understanding that what had been decided could not be undone, and Elias Boone felt the shift immediately as they moved back through the trees, the forest no longer holding him at a distance but pressing closer, as if it were watching what he would do with what it had given him, and Naomi walked beside him now instead of ahead, her pace steady, her presence no longer guiding him but standing with him, and that difference settled deep, because walking behind someone is following, but walking beside them is choosing, and Elias understood that this path, the one leading back to town, was no longer something he had been pulled into, it was something he was stepping into on his own, and the pendant rested heavy in his hand, the joined halves warm now, as if the metal itself had remembered how it was meant to feel, and he slipped it into his coat pocket without thinking, not to hide it, but to carry it close. And as they neared the edge of the woods, the sounds of the outside world began to return in fragments, the distant creak of saddle leather, the soft rhythm of hooves against packed earth, voices carried thin through open air, and Elias slowed slightly, his eyes narrowing as the shapes of riders came into view beyond the tree line, 3 of them, maybe 4, their horses restless, their posture not relaxed but alert, the kind of men who did not wait without reason, and one of them shifted in the saddle as they stepped out of the trees, recognition flashing across his face before he masked it with something harder, and Elias knew him without needing to be told, Sheriff Warren Pike, standing there like a man who had been expecting this moment but had hoped it would never arrive, and Pike's gaze moved from Elias to Naomi and back again, lingering just a second longer on her than necessary, not with fear, but with calculation, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of calm that comes from believing you are still in control. "You took a long ride for a place most folks know better than to enter," he said, his eyes fixed on Elias, as if refusing to acknowledge the present standing just a few feet to his right, and Elias did not answer right away, because he could feel the weight of what stood behind him, not just Naomi, not just the people still within the trees, but the truth itself, waiting to see if he would stand with it or step away like so many had before him, and Pike shifted slightly in the saddle. The faint jingle of metal breaking the quiet for just a second. "You find what you were looking for," he added, and there it was, not a question, not really, more like a test, a line drawn thin enough that Elias could step over it without anyone noticing, if he chose to, and for a moment, just a moment, Elias Boone thought about the life he had lived up until this morning, the land under his name, the routine that asked nothing more of him than what had already been decided, and then he thought about the letter, the pendant, the name spoken in that clearing, and he realized that stepping back now would not return him to that life, it would only leave him standing outside of something he now understood too clearly to ignore, and so he answered, his voice even, steady, "I found what was left behind," and Pike's eyes narrowed just slightly, the smallest shift, but enough to show that the answer had not landed where he expected, and one of the men behind him shifted in his saddle, glancing between Elias and Naomi with something close to unease. Because even if Pike refused to see her, the others could not ignore what stood plainly in front of them, and Naomi did not step forward, did not speak, she simply stood there, her presence quiet but undeniable, and that silence said more than any argument could have, and Pike exhaled slowly, his gaze returning fully to Elias now. "You are walking into something that does not concern you," he said, and this time there was a hint of warning beneath the calm, not loud, not forceful, but present, and Elias shook his head once, not in defiance, but in certainty. "It concerns me now," he said, and the word settled between them, simple, unadorned, but carrying a weight that Pike could not dismiss, and for the first time since they had stepped out of the trees, the sheriff's attention shifted fully to Naomi, his eyes lingering on her face, searching for something he could deny, something he could dismiss, but finding neither, and the silence stretched just long enough for the truth to stand on its own without needing to be spoken, and when Pike finally spoke again, his voice had changed, not louder, not harsher, but tighter, like something he had been holding in place was beginning to slip. "That land was settled years ago," he said. Paper signed, claims made, and Elias reached into his coat, drawing out the pendant, holding it where the light could catch it. The two halves joined as one, and he did not raise his voice, did not step closer. He simply said, "Then it is time." Those papers were read again, and the wind picked up just enough to stir the dust at their feet, carrying the scent of rain and pine out from the woods behind them. And in that quiet space between what had been claimed and what was now being brought forward, the balance began to shift, not with force, but with something far more difficult to stand against, the simple presence of truth that had finally stepped out into the open. By the time they reached the town, the sky had cleared just enough for a thin band of light to stretch across the horizon, catching on windows, fence posts, and the edges of every building like a quiet warning that something was about to be seen, whether people were ready for it or not. And Elias Boone rode at a steady pace, not rushing, not hesitating, with Nayeli beside him and Chief Tuckoda and several others following at a respectful distance. Not as an army, not as a threat, but as witnesses. And that difference mattered more than anything else, because what they carried into that town was not force, it was truth, and truth does not need to arrive loudly to be impossible to ignore. And the first to notice them were the people who always noticed everything, the ones standing outside the general store, the ones who measured change in small glances and quiet shifts, and their conversation slowed, then stopped entirely as Elias rode past, their eyes moving from him to the woman beside him, lingering there longer than comfort allowed, because even if they did not know her name, they knew what she represented, or at least what they had been told she represented, and the story they had accepted without question for 20 years did not leave room for her to be standing there in the open, breathing the same air, casting the same shadow as anyone else. And by the time Elias reached the center of town, the weight of those eyes had grown, not hostile, not yet, but uncertain. And uncertainty is the first crack in anything built on assumption. And Sheriff Warren Pike was already there, waiting in front of the courthouse, his posture composed, his expression controlled, but Elias could see it now, the slight tension beneath the surface, the way a man holds himself when he knows something he has relied on is beginning to shift. And Pike did not step forward, did not call out, he simply watched as Elias dismounted, the sound of boots against packed dirt carrying farther than it should have in the growing quiet. And Elias did not speak immediately, did not announce what he had brought. He simply reached into his coat and drew out the pendant, holding it in the open where the morning light could catch it, the silver reflecting just enough to draw every eye toward it without needing to explain why. And then he placed it on the wooden rail in front of the courthouse, not carefully, not carelessly, just deliberately, and that small action carried more weight than any raised voice could have, because it was not an argument, it was a statement. Something set down where everyone could see it, and Nayeli stepped forward then, not beside him, not behind him, but on her own, her presence steady, her gaze moving across the faces gathered there, not searching for approval, not asking for understanding, simply existing in a space that had denied her for 2 decades, and the murmur that followed was quiet but unmistakable, not fear, not disbelief, but recognition struggling against habit. And Chief Tuckoda stepped forward as well, his voice calm, carrying across the square without effort. "A name was taken from this place," he said, "and replaced with a story that served those who wished it forgotten." And no one interrupted him, no one laughed, because the tone of his voice did not invite dismissal, it invited listening. And Elias reached into his coat again, this time drawing out the folded letter, and he did not read it aloud, did not need to. He simply handed it to the nearest man standing by the courthouse steps, a clerk who had spent years recording claims and signatures without ever questioning their origin. And the man hesitated only a moment before taking it, unfolding it carefully, his eyes moving across the faded lines as the silence deepened around him. And whatever he saw there changed something, not in a dramatic way, not all at once, but enough that he looked up again, his gaze moving from Elias to Nayeli to the sheriff. And in that moment, the balance shifted, not because someone had been forced to accept something, but because they could no longer ignore it. And Pike stepped forward then, finally, his voice measured, controlled. "A letter does not change what has been settled," he said, but there was less certainty in it now, less ground beneath the words. And Elias did not argue, did not raise his voice, he simply gestured toward the pendant resting in the light, then toward Nayeli standing in full view of everyone present, and said, "Then let what was settled be seen clearly." And the wind moved through the square just enough to stir the edges of coats and dresses, carrying with it the scent of pine from the woods beyond town. And in that quiet space between what had been claimed and what was now undeniable, the truth stood on its own, not demanding belief, only refusing to be hidden any longer. No one spoke for a long moment after Elias Boone's words settled into the square, and it was not the kind of silence that comes from confusion, it was the kind that comes when something long accepted begins to loosen its hold, when people realize they are standing at the edge of a truth they had never been asked to question before, and the clerk still held the letter in his hands, his fingers careful, almost reverent now, as if he understood that what he carried was not just ink on paper but the weight of years that had been written in its place, and he looked again at Sheriff Warren Pike, not with defiance, not even with accusation, but with uncertainty, and that alone was enough to shift the balance further than any argument could have, and Pike felt it, that much was clear, not in any outward movement, but in the way his shoulders settled just a fraction lower, in the way his eyes lingered on the pendant resting in the light before moving back to Elias, and when he spoke this time, his voice was quieter, not weaker, but stripped of something it had relied on before. Even if what you are saying is true, he said, it does not change what has already been built here. And there it was, not denial, not fully, but resistance, the last place a man stands when the ground beneath him begins to shift, and Elias did not step closer, did not raise his voice, he simply answered, it changes who it belongs to, and the simplicity of that landed deeper than anything else that morning, because it did not argue with the town, did not threaten what people had made, it only asked that it be seen clearly, and Chief Tuckoda stepped forward once more, his gaze moving across the gathered faces. The land does not forget, he said, even when people choose to, and there was no anger in his tone, only a steady truth that did not need to be defended, and Nayeli stood beside the rail, her eyes moving across the town she had never been allowed to walk openly, not searching for sympathy, not demanding acknowledgement, just present, and that presence was enough, because it forced everyone watching to confront what had been hidden not by distance, but by decision. And the clerk lowered the letter slowly, his voice uncertain but clear. This record was never filed, he said, almost to himself, and a murmur moved through the small crowd, not loud, not chaotic, but shifting, like a current changing direction, and Pike exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for just a second before lifting again, and in that brief moment, something gave way, not all at once, not completely, but enough, and he looked at Nayeli directly for the first time without calculation, without dismissal, and what he saw there did not match the story he had been given, and when he spoke again, it was not to Elias, but to her. What is it you are asking? And the question carried no threat now, only the quiet weight of a man who knew he could not move forward without hearing the answer, and Nayeli stepped forward one pace, her voice steady, unchanged. Nothing that was not already mine, she said, and the word settled into the square with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding, and Elias felt something release inside him, not relief, not victory, just the absence of the tension that had carried him from the woods to this moment, because this was never about winning. It was about standing long enough for the truth to be seen, and Pike nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if acknowledging something he could no longer deny, and he turned slightly, gesturing toward the courthouse behind him. Then it will be reviewed, he said, and it was not a grand declaration, not a promise of immediate change, but it was enough, because it was a step taken in the open, where everyone could see it, and sometimes that is where justice begins, not in final decisions, but in the willingness to look again, and the tension in the square eased, not disappearing, but shifting into something quieter, something that could grow into understanding given time, and Elias reached for the pendant on the rail, picking it up and holding it out toward Nayeli, and for a moment she did not take it, her eyes meeting his, searching, measuring, and whatever she found there was enough, because she accepted it without a word, closing her fingers around it as if reclaiming something more than metal. And Elias stepped back then, just one step, but it was enough to change the space between them, enough to show that what had been carried into the town did not belong to him, and never had, and the sun had risen fully now, light spreading across the buildings, the street, the people who stood there quieter than before, and beyond them, just visible past the last line of structures, the edge of the woods remained still, unchanged, holding its silence like it always had, but something about it felt different now, not because the land had changed, but because what it had carried was no longer hidden. And as Nayeli turned her gaze briefly toward the distant line of trees, then back to the town before her, it was clear that she was no longer something remembered in whispers or denied in records. She was simply there, standing in her own name, and no one could take that from her again.